Hello YouTube. This video is about putting a bump stop on the bottom side of this frame to stop this front axle from coming up and hitting the frame. Now it's not really the axle we're worried about. It's this drag link coming up and hitting the frame and interfering with the steering, and this pitman arm coming down and hitting the top of the spring. We've done a bounce test on the front end of this vehicle. With no shocks on it, we can really get the front end going. In fact, we can get the front tires to hop off the skates. And this is what I'm talking about. The next thing you're going to see is clips of the drag link and the pitman arm areas that come close to touching but don't touch. I think you'll agree that after watching those two clips that a bump stop is not a bad idea. We don't hit anything, but boy are we close. So there's really two questions. Where does it go and how much gap do we need? Well, the first question really depends upon the spring itself. The spring doesn't just go straight up and down. As we've seen in the video, it also goes to the back. The shackles here at the rear allow the spring to move back and flatten out. So the best thing I can do to simulate that is to put a string around this front pivot point, go to the midpoint of the axle, and rotate up. Now if we do that, we can see that we are a little further back than where we are if we just go straight up. So we'll have to take that into consideration when we mount our bump stop. Now the next question was, how much space should we have? Well, we need some measurements in order to do that. And we also need to remember that this is an arc. So from the top of the drag link to the bottom of the frame is our first measurement. And if we go from the middle of the tie rod to the frame and mark that, we can take a measurement of 3 1/4 inches. If we measure from the bottom of the bolt on the pitman arm to the spring, we have 3 1/2 inches. That means the height measurement that we're concerned with is the drag link to frame, which was 3 1/4 inches. As the frame is pretty flat here, I'm just going to take the measurement right from the frame to the axle, and we have 6 1/2 inches. We want to hit our bump stop on the axle before we hit the drag link. We have a 3 1/4 inch free space here. We had 6 1/2 here. If we want to limit the travel up to 3 inches, so we have 3 inches from the axle to the bottom of the bump stop, 2 inches of bump stop, which is 5 inches, and we had a total of 6 1/2 inches. What we need is an 1.5 inch spacer to get this down to the point where it will hit the axle at 3 inches. What we need is an 1.5 inch bracket that goes between the frame and the bump stop. And what I have here is some 2x3 tubing. The bump stop fits very nicely on top of the 2x3 tubing. I've decided to make the bracket for the bump stop the length of the bump stop with no reveal. And then when we put the plates on the end of the bracket, we will have a reveal. And it'll be the same reveal that we have on the side here. So the first thing we got to do is cut 5 inches off this 2x3 tubing. That's 5 inches. Now, because it's easier to handle a large piece in a bandsaw rather than a small piece, we're going to cut this 1.5 inch line first. The end of the tube is not perfectly square. It runs off a little bit. So what we're going to have to do is measure down 1.5 inches and then scribe a line there. Let's go cut it out. Here we go on the first cut. And there we have the bases for our brackets cut out. We'll square up our end cuts and take all the saw marks out. With the ends all nice and square, we'll round them off so no one gets hurt. Now we have good foundations for our bump stops. We have to make the end plates. We have to put the nuts on the inside. And just to check, the height of the spacer and the bump stop is 3.5 inches. There's 2 major projects left on our bump stop brackets. We need to plate the ends, and we need to drill and weld nuts on the back side of the bracket for the bolts that will hold the bump stop in place. Let's draw a center line for those bolt holes. This piece of metal is 2 inches wide. And this ruler is 1 inch wide. So if I line the edge of the ruler up with the edge of the bracket, we should be in the center, and we'll score that. And that's our center line for our bolt holes. Let's check to make sure that they go through the center of the holes, and they do. The center of the bolt hole is 1/2 inch from the end of the bump stop, and we made the brackets the length of the bump stops. So if I measure 1/2 inch from the end, that's where we want our hole. We'll start with an 1/8 inch bit, and we'll finish with a 3/8 inch drill bit. We have some nice fitting bolt holes. The bolts fit real nice. The next thing we got to do is weld nuts to the back side of the bracket so that when we go to install the bump stops, all we have to do is screw the nut into the bolt that's captured inside of the bracket. We sandblasted the brackets to get all the scale off, and now we're ready to weld the nuts to the underside of the bracket. Now that we have captured nuts in the bottom of our braces, we can make the end cap. What we'll do is we'll make a template of the ends. Go straight across the end like that. Put several layers of tape on there so we got some stiffness. Mark it so we know where it came from. Tap around the outside edge to cut the tape. And there we have our template. We have our patterns stuck to an appropriate piece of metal, and we'll go cut it out on the bandsaw. Here we see the end pieces have been ground, clamped in place and ready for welding. Here we are welding the end caps on the bump stop brackets. Here we have the bump stop brackets with the end plates welded in place, and we're ready to assemble. What you're looking at here is the frame turned upside down. So the bottom side is up so that all the front end is exposed for us to work on. What we've done on this side is remove all the leaves so that we can compress the spring so that we can locate the bump stop. And we're on the way to do that on the far side. And we just pick them off. Well, we didn't think much of the string idea, so what we did is we put a crossbar underneath the frame and ratchet straps across the axle and pulled the axle down till the bump stop actually touches the axle, and this will locate the bump stop for us. We have the front suspension stripped back off the frame, and we have the bases for the bump stops clamped in place, and we're ready for welding. Here we are, tacking the bases of the bump stops to the frame. We have the bump stops installed on both sides, and now we have to do a bounce test. Watching that slow motion video was very interesting. We learned a couple of things. One is that the bump stop never touches the axle, even though I tried as hard as I could. That means that the bump stop is doing what it's supposed to do in that it protects the drag link from hitting the frame. The second thing we learned is that this rear shackle is rotating too much. And we can fix that a couple ways. Our first attempt at that is going to be re-arching the springs, and we're going to try to do that ourselves. That's the subject of another video. I believe we've accomplished what we wanted to accomplish with this video in that we built the bump stops. If you enjoyed the video, there'll be more.